If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to the second part of our column called Speculative Whiteness. My name is Alan Bailey and I'll be your co-host for this column. In this column, I'm discussing racism in the alt-right with Dr. Jordan Carroll. In this second episode, we talk about why nerds and geeks can be easy targets for the alt-right, eugenics and neurodiversity, the role the alt-right plays in fandom, and vice versa. Dr. Jordan S. Carroll is the author of Speculative Whiteness, Science Fiction in the Alt-Right, and Reading the Obscene, Transgressive Editors, and the Class Politics of U.S. Literature. His latest book is a Hugo Award finalist for Best Related Work, and his first book won the MLA Prize for Independent Scholars. He was also the recipient of the David G. Hartwell Emerging Scholar Award by the International Association for the Fantastic and the Arts. Carroll's writing has appeared in Kaleidotrope, American Literature, Post 45, Polygon, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and The Nation. You can find a link to his publisher site in the notes. All right, let's get started. Real quick, before we go any further into your project, why don't you give us the main argument of your book? Because I feel like that really correlates here.
So, speculative whiteness argues that fascists and white nationalists try to claim the future for themselves. They argue that only white men are capable of imagining the future, and only white men are capable of maintaining the self-discipline required to carry out future-oriented plans. So what that means for them is that they think that science fiction is an inherently white genre. Obviously, we know that's not true. There's an explosion of Afrofuturists and indigenous science fiction and other genre fiction right now.
Mm-hmm.
But they try to claim science fiction as their own and make the argument that science fiction is inherently white. And that's in part why some of these recent controversies surrounding, for example, people of color being cast in science fiction films have been so volatile, is that they see this as crucial to the political project that they are trying to enact right now.
Interesting. You mentioned that the first leader of the neo-Nazi group came straight out of science fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or I should say straight out of science fiction fandom.
Mm-hmm.
Why are nerds or geeks or whatever the terminology is these days, why are we easy pickings for the alt-right?
I think the alt-right targets people who feel resentment for not being recognized as much as they'd like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of science fiction fans, obviously we don't want to stereotype too much, but a lot of science fiction fans historically have felt marginalized, have felt like outsiders, and have felt like that they are really bright people, but that their talents are going to waste because the larger society or culture doesn't recognize them. Obviously, there are different ways to respond to that situation. One would be to imagine a world in which everybody was allowed to use their gifts and use their intelligence. But for the alt-right, what they do is promote this myth that some people are smart elites who know better than everybody else and who therefore should rule. And they also suggest that innate potential, that intelligence or giftedness is biological or genetic in nature, and that only some populations, and here it's usually white men, are capable of greatness, is what they try to suggest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of it is a broader fascist tendency to find people who are maybe they have an identity that's privileged in some respects, that they're in some ways part of the dominant group, but they feel like they haven't realized the greatness that they saw as part of their future.
Yeah. Yeah. Within your book, you have this guy named Nick Land, right? And he talks about
Mm-hmm.
nerds wanting to become separate from everybody else, which I think you've just hit on a lot in that explanation, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a nerd myself, I certainly felt that way a lot, especially when I was younger. These days, I have looked back and realized that really I'm just neurodivergent, right? And neurotypical people just never really understood me. And so these days I just kind of ignore that or work around it, right? Do you feel that there's a connection between some of these people and neurodivergence, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because of that inherent feeling of being an outsider?
I think it's complicated because on one hand, there is a wing of the alt-right that is very much eugenicist in orientation and are definitely not on the side of neurodivergence. On the other hand, yeah, there are people like Nick Land who see people who are neurodivergent as part of a potential master race.
Mhm.
And this is in some ways equally eugenicist, but suggesting that there's something superior to neurodivergent people. And the goal then should be to liquidate everyone else
Mhm.
as part of this project of breeding a better race of human beings. And ultimately for Nick Land, like transcending the human species entirely.
Yeah, yeah. Hmm. So you also mentioned that a lot of the alt-right are overeducated men, right? They're, like, not earning what they think they should earn, or they're not having, the success that they believe that they should have, right?
Mhm.
But I am curious about that because, reading through your book, they make some very illogical or strange leaps, at least in my opinion. And as someone who is also an educator and very focused on teaching critical thinking skills, you know, it seems to me that they lack a lot of critical thinking skills. Is that is that a statement about how we educate people in the US, or is that a statement more about the human condition in general? I mean, do people just believe what they want to believe, what makes them feel better about themselves?
I think it might be the latter because a lot of these people were, in some ways, marginal in the academic communities that they were part of. So I think that they are taking what education that they had and twisting it towards their own particular purposes. They might draw on, in the case of Richard Spencer, some of their graduate education, but they definitely leave off, as you point out, that critical component that would allow them to take a step back and reflect on what they think and ultimately dismantle, I think, their
Mm,
ideas. So it's a little bit of education can be a dangerous thing, I think, where they feel like they understand intellectual history and they think of themselves as intellectuals, but they often do have a superficial engagement with a lot of these sources, and they often have a very narrow view of what's been said and what's been uncovered in different academic fields. If they knew more, I think that they would probably begin to question some of these things that they're
yeah,
saying.
yeah. I know oftentimes when I'm reading about or very rarely interacting with somebody with these kinds of ideas, I just am overwhelmed by this sense of intellectual laziness, just I know what I know and I'm done with it and I'm not going to really pursue anything that challenges my already
I think that,
go ahead.
yeah, I think that's true. I think there's something about these lines of thought that has to destroy further inquiry to continue. I mean, I think that once you start believing that all of history is fixed and determined by race, at that point, in order to maintain that idea, you have to ignore so much about the world. And
Mhm.
eliminate so much sophistication from the concepts that you use in order to accommodate that basic prejudice about how things work.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. All right. I'm going to take it back to a little more of a pragmatic level here. We were talking about fandom and conferences, right? Now, I know that your experience with conferences has been limited, but you have studied a lot of fandom. What problematic behaviors do you see in, modern conferences, or maybe even unconscious, problematic behavior? And it doesn't have to be conferences, just, any fandom stuff.
I mean, as you point out, I don't have a ton of experience with conferences, so I don't know about interpersonal behavior at
Mhm,
conferences. But I do think that in fandom more broadly, there is sometimes a tendency to become protective of whatever it is you're a fan of. And as a result, turn off those critical faculties and try to save it from any possible interrogation
mhm,
or change. Sometimes I think that when people get so into the lore of something, for example, I've done I've done a lot of work on Warhammer 40K, that they don't realize that this was something made by human beings, or at least they don't acknowledge that this was something made by human beings, and therefore it could just as easily change to
mm,
accommodate an evolving understanding of the world. So I think that one of the problems with fandom, and in some ways, like, it's understandable. You want to preserve the things that you love, but that occasionally gets in the way of making something better, essentially.
mhm. Yeah, totally, totally. It's like the last 3 Star Wars movies, right?
Mhm.
I think it was the second one when so many people complained online about what was happening that they they changed the ending of the 3rd Star Wars to appease a lot of these trolls online. I believe that's how it went. So yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I could totally see that. And then you've got the Gamergate stuff, right? And you've got just all anything with a large fandom, I feel like turns into this kind of a thing, or can turn into it.
Yeah, definitely. It's this idea that something new can destroy your childhood, essentially. I think that the idea that if we change Star Wars, it somehow invalidates your past memories of Star Wars. And I think that this comes down ultimately to if you make your entire identity around a particular media, that can prevent you from changing and evolving with the new things that come out, and make that attachment, that kind of almost excessive attachment to something, can get in the way of, I think, a more interesting and diverse form of fandom.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's a certain fandom that I want to hit on in a second, but first I want to talk about how the alt-right influences fandom and how fandom influences the alt-right, and like that play between the two things. So I guess let's start with what role does fandom play in the alt-right presently? It's like we know a lot of these past folks have come from the alt-right, but what's it look like now?
I think fandom serves in part as a vehicle to promote fascist ideas. Most of us are not going to listen to anything that comes out of white nationalist circles, but when they package it as part of the conversation around the latest film or television show, suddenly that appears on our timelines. And even if we don't even know where this is coming from, we're seeing
Mhm.
this ongoing debate about the new Star Wars or about a video game. And obviously, the more critical fans are capable of thinking twice about that. But there is a group, I think, of fans who will see that and be pulled in. It becomes a gateway into fascist ideology. So rather than outright stating the propaganda, they are trying to frame this as a statement on science fiction or a statement on fantasy or on video games.
Mhm. Mhm. I feel like you may have already answered this to some degree, but thinking about it from the opposite direction, even if you want to talk about the ancient history of what are they called, the rabid puppies and the sad puppies and all that,
Yeah,
it was an incident that was very visible to a lot of people, even people who don't really know anything about science fiction culture.
I think that the rabid puppies controversy points to the ways that right-wing ideas have been endemic to science fiction and fantasy for a long time. And it shows that the current canon of progressive science fiction and fantasy and horror is not a given. It's something that we've achieved over time. But if you look at the longer history of the genre, there have long been people on the right, um, and it's in some ways a genre that, as many scholars have pointed out, emerged out of colonialism and, in its earliest days, often embodied white supremacist ideologies. And so, what we saw with Rabid Puppies was an attempt to roll back the genre to a previous moment in time. They often valorized the older tradition of pulp science fiction and pulp
Mhm.
genre fiction and wanted to return to a moment that they were nostalgic for prior to more politically conscious science fiction and fantasy. Although, again, like at the same time, even though in the early 20th century there were authors telling stories about white men conquering other planets because of their innate superiority, there are also socialist and feminist science fiction authors too, which goes to show that this is a struggle for what science fiction means, and ultimately who gets the right to create science fiction and speculative fiction.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about that. We were talking about fandoms before, toxic fandoms, right? And prior to that, we were jokingly talking about, who's better, Heinlein or PKD, right?
Mhm.
It seems like a ton of people ton of people on the right, let me say, are really obsessed with Heinlein. And
Mhm.
now I am not a Heinlein scholar, but I've been around, I've read some of his work, and not all of his work is super right wing, right? And in fact, our podcast is named after one of his stories, partially. And both of my co hosts really like Heinlein. Kat named one of her books after Heinlein. What is their obsession with Heinlein? Why are they not obsessed with Clark, for example, or Bradbury?
He is a complicated figure. I think we have to give credit to Heinlein for introducing a lot of the more sociological aspects of science fiction, or at least popularizing that. I mean, he is somebody who's
Mhm.
not just interested in gadgets, as some of the more classical era science fiction writers are. And his politics are constantly changing. I feel like from one book to the next,
Mhm.
it's hard to pin him down. But also, he, at least at some moments, was a hardcore libertarian, and in a book like Farnham's Freehold, although it bills itself in some sense as an anti-racist parable, is, I think, deeply embedded in white supremacist assumptions about how the world works. But I
Mhm.
mean, yeah, I don't think I haven't seen much reference to Clark in the far right. I think partly because Clark is someone with a more cosmopolitan view of the world. And in a text like Childhood's End, he is interested in this idea of the group consciousness, the merging of
Mhm.
different minds into a gestalt entity, which I think is really frightening for the right. And we see it as well, I think, in Heinlein
Mm.
as well. Like, I feel like Heinlein is often trying to bury someone like Olaf Stapledon, a vision of the world where we transcend not only borders and nationalities, but ultimately our own personal identities to become something more. And that's, I think, anathema to the right who is invested in a world of survival of the fittest, competition, a clash and struggle between individuals or between ethnic, racial, or national groups.
Listening to you talk about that makes something like the Borg from Star Trek very interesting to think about, because not only are they a fascist representation, right, but they also have this hive mind kind of thing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of representations of hive minds are about a kind of Cold War anti-communism and about a fear of what the world would look like without capitalist competition.
And that's all for this episode. Don't forget to rate and review us if you like what we're doing. You can find us on Patreon and Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi. If you'd like to support us monetarily. In the next episode of this series that we are calling Motherfucking Nazi Info Dump, we will be discussing a lot of terms in order to better understand the alt-right in science fiction. So keep an eye out for that episode coming soon. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again soon.